In the winter of 1864, when vigilantes finally stormed the cabin of Montana Territory's most trusted lawman, they discovered something that would haunt the American frontier forever. Sheriff Henry Playmer, the man who had sworn to protect Bannock City's citizens, had been systematically orchestrating their murders for over 3 years. Hidden beneath floorboards were detailed maps marking every gold shipment route, personal belongings of dozens of missing travelers, and a leather-bound ledger containing the names of 102 confirmed victims. What they found next would reveal the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in the history of the American West. A network so intricate that it had infiltrated every level of territorial government, turning the very concept of law and order into an instrument of terror. Before we continue with the story of Henry Playmer and his reign of terror in Montana Territory, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly what we uncover here. And in the comments below, let me know what state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from all corners of America. The truth about Sheriff Playmer would only emerge decades later, buried in territorial records that authorities had desperately tried to suppress. Bannock City, Montana Territory, 1862. The town had sprung up almost overnight when prospector John White discovered gold along Grasshopper Creek in July of that year. Within months, what had been empty wilderness became a bustling mining camp of nearly 4,000 souls, all chasing the same glittering dream. Crude log cabins and canvas tents lined the muddy streets while saloons, general stores, and gambling halls competed for space with the constant stream of newcomers arriving daily. The territorial government, headquartered hundreds of miles away in distant Washington, D.C., struggled to maintain any semblance of order in these remote outposts. Local law enforcement was often the only authority that mattered, and finding men willing to wear a badge in such lawless territory proved nearly impossible. Most decent men were too busy working their claims or had families to protect. The job typically attracted drifters, former soldiers, or those with questionable pasts who saw opportunity in chaos. Among the prospectors flooding into Bannock was a man named Henry Playmer. At 31 years old, he cut an impressive figure, tall and lean, with carefully groomed dark hair and a mustache that gave him an air of respectability. Unlike most of the rough-hewn miners, Playmer wore clean clothes, spoke with education, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. He claimed to have been a lawman back in California and Nevada, though he remained vague about the specific details of his service. The miners and merchants of Bannock took to him immediately. Here was a man who seemed capable of bringing order to their chaotic community. When word spread that the territorial governor was looking to appoint a sheriff for the newly formed Bannock district, Playmer's name was mentioned by nearly everyone. Local businessman Elkanah Morris vouched for his character, as did several other prominent citizens who had been impressed by Playmer's calm demeanor and apparent knowledge of law enforcement procedures. What they didn't know was that Henry Playmer had indeed been involved with law enforcement in California, but not in the way they imagined. He had been arrested multiple times for various crimes, including assault and suspected murder. His most recent departure from California had been rather sudden, following the mysterious death of a rival who had been courting the same woman Playmer desired. But in the isolation of Montana Territory, where communication with the outside world was sporadic at best, such details were impossible to verify. The gold strikes in the region had created a perfect storm of opportunity and vulnerability. Every week, successful miners would make the dangerous journey to Salt Lake City or other established towns to deposit their gold or purchase supplies. These men carried their fortunes in leather pouches and saddlebags, traveling through hundreds of miles of wilderness on routes that were predictable out of necessity. The few established trails had to follow river valleys and mountain passes, making them natural ambush points for anyone with criminal intent. As winter approached in 1862, the citizens of Bannock were dealing with more than just the harsh Montana cold. Travelers on the Salt Lake City route had been disappearing with alarming frequency. At first, it was easy to dismiss these disappearances as the natural dangers of frontier travel, wild animals, harsh weather, or hostile Native American tribes. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Well-armed, experienced travelers were vanishing without a trace, often on routes they had traveled safely multiple times before. The fear was palpable in Bannock saloons and gathering places. Men who had struck it rich were afraid to leave town with their gold. Yet, staying meant watching their hard-earned wealth lose value. As supplies grew scarce and expensive, the territorial government's assurances that military patrols were being increased did little to calm nerves, especially since these patrols seemed to have no better luck than civilian travelers in avoiding the mysterious disappearances. It was in this atmosphere of growing anxiety that Henry Playmumber made his bid for the sheriff's position. He spoke eloquently about the need for local law enforcement that understood the unique challenges of mining territory. He proposed organizing citizen patrols and establishing way stations along the major routes. His ideas impressed the territorial authorities, and in late 1862, Henry Playmumber was officially appointed sheriff of Bannock District, a territory that encompassed hundreds of square miles of some of the most remote and dangerous land in America. The appointment was celebrated throughout Bannock. Finally, they had a sheriff who seemed capable of dealing with their growing security problems. Playmumber wasted no time in recruiting deputies, carefully selecting men who shared his vision of effective law enforcement. Among his first appointments were Buck Stinson, a former soldier who claimed experience in tracking and wilderness survival, and Ned Ray, a soft-spoken man who had earned respect for his skill with firearms. What the citizens of Bannock didn't realize was that their new sheriff had just gained official control over the very territory where travelers were disappearing. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came on a bitter, cold morning in January 1863. Thomas Caldwell, a merchant from Virginia City, had planned to make the journey to Salt Lake City with a substantial shipment of gold dust, nearly $8,000 worth, representing months of successful trading with local miners. Caldwell was known as a cautious man who never traveled alone and always informed Sheriff Playmumber of his planned routes and departure times, both as a courtesy to local law enforcement and as a security measure. On the morning of the 15th of January, Caldwell stopped by Sheriff Playmumber's office as usual. The sheriff's log, which would later be recovered, contained a detailed entry of their conversation. Caldwell planned to take the northern route along the Beaverhead River, accompanied by 2 armed guards, and expected to reach the first way station by evening. Playmumber had wished him safe travels and promised to send a deputy to check the route if they hadn't received word of Caldwell's safe arrival within a week. Caldwell never reached the first way station. More disturbing, his 2 guards never returned to Bannock either. When Deputy Buck Stinson organized a search party a week later, they found evidence of the group's passage along the expected route. Cold campfire ashes, horse droppings, even discarded food scraps, but about 30 miles from town, all traces simply vanished. It was as if 3 men and their horses had been erased from existence. The search continued for days, with volunteers combing every ravine and creek bed in the area. What they eventually discovered would haunt the territory for decades to come. Hidden in a grove of pine trees nearly a mile from the main trail, they found a hastily dug grave containing 3 bodies. The men had been shot execution-style, single bullets to the back of the head. Their horses, saddles, weapons, and the gold were nowhere to be found. But it was the condition of the scene that truly disturbed the searchers. This had not been a random robbery by desperate bandits. The killers had taken time to strip the bodies of anything valuable, including boots, clothing, and personal effects. More chilling, someone had carved crude symbols into nearby trees, markings that meant nothing to the search party, but suggested some sort of organized group rather than random criminals. Sheriff Playmumber arrived at the scene within hours of the discovery, and his reaction was exactly what the citizens expected from their dedicated lawman. He examined every detail meticulously, took careful notes, and organized an expanded search of the surrounding area. He spoke with quiet determination about bringing the killers to justice and promised that no effort would be spared in hunting down those responsible for such a heinous crime. What no one noticed at the time was how efficiently Playmumber directed the search away from certain areas, or how quickly he dismissed potential evidence that might have led in particular directions. His deputies, Buck Stinson and Ned Ray, seemed unusually knowledgeable about the terrain and were remarkably skilled at predicting where evidence might or might not be found. The discovery of Caldwell's murder sent shockwaves through Bannock and the surrounding mining camps. If 3 well-armed men could be ambushed and killed so efficiently, What hope did anyone have of safe travel? The killers had demonstrated not only ruthless efficiency, but also detailed knowledge of travel routes and timing. This wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals. It suggested planning, coordination, and inside information. Sheriff Plaimyumba called a town meeting the following Sunday at the Methodist Church, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd. Standing before the assembled citizens, he painted a grim picture of the challenges they faced. The territory was vast and sparsely populated, making it nearly impossible to patrol effectively. The killers clearly had experience and organization, suggesting they might be former soldiers or experienced frontiersmen rather than common criminals. But Plaimyumba also offered hope. He proposed expanding his deputy force and establishing a network of informants among the local population. He suggested that merchants coordinate their travel schedules to move in larger, better protected groups. Most importantly, he emphasized the need for complete cooperation between citizens and law enforcement. Any suspicious activity, any strangers asking unusual questions, any information that might help identify the criminals should be reported immediately. The citizens left that meeting feeling reassured that their sheriff was taking decisive action. What they couldn't have known was that Henry Plaimyumba was indeed taking decisive action to ensure that his criminal enterprise would continue to operate with maximum efficiency and minimal risk of discovery. Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip on Montana territory, the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity. But now there was a pattern that began to emerge to anyone paying careful attention. The victims were almost always men known to be carrying significant amounts of gold. They were traveling routes that had been previously safe, and in almost every case, Sheriff Plaimyumba or one of his deputies had been informed of the travel plans in advance. By spring of 1863, the situation in Bannack had deteriorated beyond anything the original settlers could have imagined. What had begun as isolated incidents of highway robbery had evolved into something far more systematic and terrifying. The territorial governor's office in distant Washington, D.C. began receiving increasingly desperate letters from Montana citizens begging for federal intervention and additional military protection. The fear was changing the very nature of life in the mining camps. Men who had struck it rich were afraid to leave with their gold, creating an artificial scarcity of currency and driving up prices for basic supplies. Some miners began melting their gold dust into crude ingots and hiding them in increasingly elaborate caches rather than risk the journey to established banks. Others simply abandoned their claims altogether, preferring poverty in safer territories to wealth that couldn't be safely transported. Sheriff Plaimyumba seemed to thrive in this atmosphere of crisis. He worked tirelessly, often spending days in the saddle, pursuing leads and investigating reports of suspicious activity. His dedication impressed even the most skeptical citizens. When territorial officials visited Bannack to assess the situation, they found a lawman who appeared to be doing everything humanly possible under impossible circumstances. What they were actually witnessing was a masterpiece of criminal deception. Plummers's tireless investigations were actually reconnaissance missions, gathering intelligence on potential victims and refining the routes and methods used by his gang. His expanded network of informants were criminals, providing him with detailed information about gold shipments, travel plans, and the personal habits of wealthy miners. The genius of Plummers's operation lay not just in its scope, but in its legitimacy. As sheriff, he had legal authority to question travelers about their destinations and cargo. He could requisition supplies, deputize additional men, and coordinate with other law enforcement agencies across the territory. Most crucially, he was responsible for investigating the very crimes he was orchestrating, allowing him to misdirect suspicion and eliminate evidence. But even the most carefully planned criminal enterprise creates loose ends, and by summer of 1863, those loose ends were beginning to accumulate. The problem was that Plummer's gang had grown too large and too successful. What had started as a small group of disciplined criminals had expanded to include dozens of men operating across hundreds of square miles. Managing such an organization required constant communication, coordination, and discipline, all of which became increasingly difficult as the body count rose. The first crack in Plummer's facade appeared in July 1863 when a wounded man stumbled into Virginia City with an incredible story. James Romer, a trader from Salt Lake City, had been traveling with two companions when they were ambushed near Beaverhead Rock. His companions had been killed instantly, but Roma had been shot in the shoulder and had fallen from his horse into a creek bed where he remained hidden while the attackers searched for survivors. What made Roma's account different from previous attacks was the detail he could provide about his attackers. He had recognized one of them, a man named George Ives, who was known around the mining camps as one of Sheriff Playmamer's most trusted informants. More disturbing, Roma had overheard fragments of conversation that suggested this was not a random robbery, but part of a larger, organized operation. When word of Roma's testimony reached Bannock, Sheriff Playmumber moved quickly to investigate. He interviewed Roma personally, taking careful notes and promising a thorough investigation. Publicly, he expressed shock and concern that one of his informants might be involved in criminal activity. He immediately issued a warrant for George Ives and organized a manhunt that continued for weeks. What Plummer was actually doing was damage control. George Ives had violated the cardinal rule of their operation by allowing a witness to survive. The manhunt was real, but its purpose was not to bring Ives to justice. It was to find him before other law enforcement agencies could capture him alive. A captured George Ives represented an existential threat to the entire organization. The chase for George Ives became a territory-wide sensation, with rewards posted and volunteer posies forming in every mining camp. For 3 months, Ives managed to evade capture, apparently aided by a network of sympathizers and safe houses that stretched across Montana territory. The longer the chase continued, the more questions arose about how a known criminal could remain at large in such a sparsely populated region. The questions became more pointed when other suspicious incidents began to receive closer scrutiny. Merchants and miners started comparing notes about their interactions with Sheriff Playmumber and his deputies. Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before. The sheriff's unusual interest in travel plans, the convenient absence of his deputies during certain attacks, the remarkable lack of progress in solving any of the highway robberies, despite the sheriff's apparent dedication to the task. The situation reached a critical point in October 1863 when a group of Virginia City businessmen led by merchant William Palmer decided to take matters into their own hands. They had lost too much money and too many friends to continue relying on official law enforcement. They quietly began organizing what they called a committee of vigilance. Citizens who would investigate and, if necessary, dispense justice when official channels had failed. The formation of vigilance committees was not uncommon in frontier territories where legal authority was weak or corrupt. What made the Virginia City Committee different was the caliber of men who joined and the methodical approach they took to their investigation. These were not angry mobs seeking revenge, but educated, successful businessmen who understood the importance of evidence and due process, even when operating outside official legal channels. Palmer and his associates began their investigation with the one advantage that Sheriff Playmumber didn't know they possessed. They suspected him. Instead of reporting their findings to local law enforcement, they quietly gathered evidence and built a case using methods that Playmumber couldn't monitor or control. They interviewed survivors like James Romer again, but this time without the sheriff's knowledge. They compared notes from different attacks, looking for patterns that suggested inside knowledge or coordination. What they discovered was far worse than simple corruption or incompetence. The Virginia City Committee of Vigilance spent months building their case with the methodical precision of experienced prosecutors, led by William Palmer and businessman Wilbur Sanders, a lawyer who had recently arrived from Ohio. They understood that accusations against a sitting sheriff required overwhelming evidence. What they uncovered was a criminal conspiracy that defied belief in both its scope and its audacity. The breakthrough came in November 1863, when committee member John Bozeman managed to capture Red Jagger, a known associate of George I, who had been wanted for questioning in several attacks. Unlike previous captures that had been handled by Sheriff Plamer's office, Jagger was held in secret by the Vigilance Committee and interrogated using methods that were both more sophisticated and more direct than official police procedures of the time. Under intense questioning, Red Jagger revealed information that transformed the committee's understanding of what they were facing. The highway robberies were not the work of a loose confederation of bandits, but rather a highly organized criminal enterprise with over 30 active members operating across 3 territorial districts. The gang had an official name. They called themselves the Innocences. and they operated with military-like precision and discipline. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. According to Yerger, the leader of the Innocents was not some mysterious outlaw chief operating from hidden mountain strongholds. The leader was Sheriff Henry Playmumber himself, and the organization's headquarters was located in the basement of Bannock's official sheriff's office. George's testimony included details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the organization could have known. He described a sophisticated communication system using coded messages and signal fires that allowed gang members to coordinate across hundreds of miles of territory. He revealed the existence of detailed maps showing every major gold shipment route, complete with notations about the best ambush points and escape routes. Most damning, he provided the names of dozens of local citizens who were secretly part of the organization, including several of Playmer's official deputies. The Vigilance Committee faced a dilemma that was unprecedented in American frontier justice. They had uncovered evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple robbery or murder. This was systematic terrorism directed against an entire territorial population by the very officials charged with protecting them. Traditional legal processes were not just inadequate, they were compromised at the most fundamental level. Wilbur Sanders, with his legal background, advocated for a careful, methodical approach. They needed to gather additional evidence, identify all members of the organization, and plan their response to minimize the risk of retaliation against innocent citizens. Palmer and the other businessmen, however, argued that delay was too dangerous. Every day that Plummer remained in office meant more deaths and more opportunities for the gang to discover the committee's investigation. While the committee debated strategy, events were moving rapidly in other parts of the territory. George Ives, still the subject of the territory-wide manhunt, had finally been cornered near the Stinking Water River by a posy that included both official deputies and civilian volunteers. What happened next would provide the Vigilance Committee with the final piece of evidence they needed. Ives had been captured alive, contrary to what Sheriff Playmumber undoubtedly preferred. Worse, he had been captured by a mixed group that included men the sheriff couldn't control. When word reached Bannock that Ives was being brought to Nevada City for questioning, Playmumber immediately organized a group of his most trusted deputies to transport the prisoner to Bannock, where he could be properly interrogated and held for trial. But the citizens of Nevada City refused to turn Ives over to Plummer's custody. They had grown suspicious of the sheriff's inability to solve any of the highway robbery cases, and they were determined to conduct their own interrogation of the first suspect to be captured alive. The confrontation between Plummer's deputies and the Nevada City citizens created a tense standoff that lasted for days. During this standoff, something remarkable happened. Citizens from Virginia City, Nevada City, and other mining camps began to converge on the area, drawn by news that George Ives had finally been captured. What started as a simple prisoner transfer became an impromptu mass meeting of Montana Territory's most concerned citizens. And for the first time since the robberies had begun, they were able to compare notes and share information outside of Sheriff Playmer's supervision. The conversations that took place during those cold December days in 1863 were reveille. Miners and merchants who had never met before discovered that they had remarkably similar experiences with Sheriff Playmumber and his deputies. The same patterns of unusual interest in travel plans, the same convenient absences during attacks, the same lack of progress in investigations, despite apparent dedication and hard work. More disturbing, several men came forward with information they had previously kept to themselves. A blacksmith from Bannock described how Sheriff Playmumber had commissioned special horseshoes designed to create misleading tracks. A supply merchant revealed that Playmumber had purchased unusual quantities of ammunition and supplies that were never accounted for in official records. A telegraph operator admitted that he had been instructed to delay or misdirect certain messages related to criminal investigations. As the evidence mounted, the impromptu gathering took on the character of a trial. George Ives found himself facing not just formal charges, but a comprehensive review of the entire criminal conspiracy that the citizens believed he represented. Under intense questioning from multiple interrogators and facing a crowd that was growing more hostile by the hour, Ives began to reveal details that corroborated and expanded upon Red Jagger's earlier testimony. The picture that emerged was truly horrifying. The Innocents had been responsible for at least 100 deaths over the past 2 years, making them one of the most prolific criminal organizations in American history. They had systematically targeted successful miners, merchants, and travelers, using inside information to predict movements and maximize profits while minimizing risks. The organization had infiltrated every level of territorial government, from local sheriffs to territorial commissioners. But perhaps most chilling was Ives's description of Henry Plummer's personal involvement in the murders. This was not a case of a corrupt official who looked the other way or accepted bribes. Plummer had personally participated in many of the killings, often using his official authority to disarm victims or lure them into vulnerable positions. He had developed a reputation among gang members for his cold efficiency and his ability to kill without emotion or hesitation. The revelations about George Ives sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, but they also created an immediate and deadly problem. Word of the interrogation was spreading rapidly throughout the territory, and everyone knew that Sheriff Plummer and his remaining gang members would soon learn that their organization had been exposed. The question was not whether they would retaliate, but how quickly and how violently. Wilbur Saunders and the other Vigilance Committee members found themselves in an impossible situation. They now had overwhelming evidence of the conspiracy, but they were hundreds of miles from any federal authority capable of handling such a massive criminal organization. Local territorial officials were either incompetent or compromised. Meanwhile, Henry Plummer remained at large with dozens of armed followers, and he now had every reason to eliminate witnesses and evidence before fleeing the territory. The decision of what to do with George Ives became symbolic of the larger question facing Montana Territory's citizens. Traditional legal processes had not just failed, they had been systematically subverted by the very criminals they were supposed to control. Yet, taking the law into their own hands meant crossing a line that could transform them from citizens seeking justice into vigilantes dispensing frontier revenge. The debate raged for hours among the assembled citizens. Some argued that Ives should be transported to Salt Lake City, or even back to Washington, D.C., where federal authorities could guarantee a fair trial and proper legal procedures. Others pointed out that such a journey would be incredibly dangerous, requiring them to transport a prisoner through territory controlled by his criminal associates, with no guarantee that federal authorities would be any more effective than territorial officials had been. As night fell on the 19th of December, 1863, the crowd reached a fateful decision. George Ives would be tried immediately by a citizens' court, with Wilbur Saunders acting as prosecutor and a local miner named Charles Bagg serving as defense counsel. The trial would follow proper legal procedures as much as possible, but it would be conducted under the authority of the assembled citizens rather than any official territorial court. The trial began immediately, conducted by lamplight in the bitter Montana cold. Saunders methodically presented the evidence that had been gathered over months of investigation, supplemented by Ives's own admissions and the testimony of Red Joe and other captured gang members. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, not just for the specific crimes Ives was charged with, but for his participation in a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized the entire territory. But even as the trial proceeded, disturbing news was arriving from other parts of Montana Territory. Riders reported that Sheriff Plummer and a large group of armed men had been seen moving toward Nevada City, apparently intending to rescue Ives or silence the witnesses who were testifying against him. Other reports suggested that gang members throughout the territory had been activated and were preparing for a coordinated response to the exposure of their organization. The trial took on an increasingly desperate urgency as the assembled citizens realized they were racing against time. If Plummer and his followers arrived before they could complete their proceedings, the opportunity for justice might disappear forever. Worse, the witnesses and Vigilance Committee members who had exposed the conspiracy would likely be killed in retaliation. Charles Bagg, serving as Ives's defense counsel, made the best case he could under the circumstances. He argued that his client had been coerced into joining the gang, that he had not personally participated in murders, and that the proper venue for such serious charges was a federal court with full legal protections. But the evidence against Ives was simply too overwhelming, and the immediate danger to the community too urgent. As dawn broke on the 21st of December, 1863, the Citizens' Court reached its verdict. George Ives was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and robbery, and the sentence was death by hanging. The execution was carried out immediately, using a rope thrown over a makeshift gallows constructed from a nearby building. Ives's last words, according to multiple witnesses, were a warning that Henry Playmer and the remaining gang members would never allow the citizens' rebellion to succeed. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Montana Territory intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of corruption and frontier justice. The execution of George Ives marked a point of no return for both the citizens of Montana Territory and the remaining members of the Innocents. Word of the Citizens' Court and its dramatic conclusion spread rapidly throughout the region, creating a wave of both hope and terror. For law-abiding citizens, it represented the first successful challenge to the criminal organization that had controlled their lives for years. For Henry Playmer and his followers, it represented a mortal threat that required immediate and decisive response. Playmer's reaction to news of the execution revealed the true nature of the man behind the sheriff's badge. Rather than attempting to maintain his facade of legitimate law enforcement, he abandoned all pretense and activated his entire criminal network for what amounted to open warfare against Montana Territory citizens. The mask had finally been torn away, revealing the cold-blooded killer who had hidden behind a badge for so long. Reports began flooding in from across the territory of armed groups conducting what could only be described as terrorism against civilian populations. Isolated farms were burned, mining camps were raided, and anyone suspected of supporting the Vigilance Committee was targeted for intimidation or worse. Playmer had transformed his criminal organization from a secretive conspiracy into an army of occupation, attempting to crush citizen resistance through fear and violence. But the citizens of Montana Territory had crossed their own point of no return. The success of the George Ives trial had proven that organized resistance to the Innocents was possible. More importantly, it had exposed the full scope of the criminal conspiracy and identified many of its key members. There could be no going back to the old system of ineffective law enforcement and murdered travelers. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether Montana Territory would be governed by law or by criminal terror. The final phase of the confrontation between Montana Territory citizens and Henry Playmer's criminal empire began on a frigid morning in early January 1864. Acting on intelligence gathered from captured gang members, the Vigilance Committee had identified the locations where Plummer and his key lieutenants were likely to be found. But apprehending a sitting sheriff and his deputies required careful coordination and overwhelming force. Any mistake could result in the criminals escaping justice, or worse, successfully intimidating the citizens back into submission. Wilbur Sanders and William Palmer had spent weeks planning what they called the final accounting. They had divided the remaining gang members into three categories: those who could be captured alive for trial, those who represented such a threat that immediate action was necessary, and those who might be allowed to flee the territory if they abandoned their criminal activities. The goal was not vengeance, but the complete dismantling of the Innocents as a functional organization. The first target was Buck Stinson, one of Playmer's most trusted deputies and a man who had personally participated in dozens of murders. Stinson was known to frequent a cabin near Bannock, where he conducted unofficial business away from the sheriff's office. On the morning of the 10th of January, 1864, a group of 20 vigilantes surrounded the cabin just before dawn. What they found inside provided final confirmation of the conspiracy's scope and Henry Playmer's personal involvement. The cabin served as a communication center and armory for the gang, containing maps of every major travel route in the territory, marked with symbols indicating successful attacks. More damning were Plummer's personal correspondence files, including detailed letters coordinating attacks with gang members as far away as Utah Territory and detailed financial records showing how profits from robberies were distributed among organization members. But the most chilling discovery was Plummer's personal journal, written in his own careful handwriting. The entries dated back to his arrival in Montana Territory and described not just his criminal activities, but his psychological attitude toward them. Plummer wrote about his victims with cold detachment, referring to them as problems to be solved and obstacles to progress. He described the challenge of maintaining his legitimate facade while orchestrating murders, expressing satisfaction at his ability to fool the very citizens he was systematically robbing and killing. The journal entries revealed a man who was not just a criminal, but a sociopath who took genuine pleasure in the elaborate deception he had maintained. He wrote extensively about the irony of citizens coming to him for protection from crimes he was committing, and he expressed particular satisfaction in personally investigating murders he had orchestrated. The final entries, written just weeks before his exposure, showed increasing paranoia and plans for eliminating witnesses and fleeing to Mexico with his accumulated wealth. Buxton offered no resistance when confronted with this evidence. Like George East before him, he seemed to understand that the citizens' patience had been exhausted and that traditional legal protections no longer applied. Under questioning, he provided additional details about the organization's structure and confirmed that Henry Playmumber had been not just the leader, but the architect of the entire conspiracy. Armed with Stinson's confession and the documentary evidence from the cabin, the Vigilance Committee moved quickly to apprehend the remaining key figures in the organization. Ned Ray was captured at his home in Bannack, along with additional records that revealed the financial scope of the conspiracy. Over the previous 2 years, the Innocents had stolen an estimated $500,000 in gold and currency, an enormous sum that represented the life savings of hundreds of murdered victims. But Henry Playmumber himself remained at large, and capturing him alive posed unique challenges. As a sitting sheriff, he retained some degree of official authority and could potentially rally support from territorial officials who were unaware of his criminal activities. More importantly, he was known to be heavily armed, extremely dangerous, and desperate enough to fight to the death rather than face capture and inevitable execution. The manhunt for Sheriff Playmumber became the largest law enforcement operation in Montana Territory's history, involving over 100 citizens and covering thousands of square miles. Unlike previous searches that Plummer had controlled and misdirected, this operation was coordinated by men who understood his methods and psychology. They anticipated his likely escape routes, identified his remaining allies, and moved systematically to close off every avenue of escape. The final confrontation came on the 14th of January, 1864, at a ranch house 20 miles south of Bannack, where Playmumber had taken refuge with the last group of loyal gang members. Surrounded and outnumbered, Playmumber attempted to negotiate, offering to provide information about buried treasure and gang members who had escaped to other territories in exchange for safe passage to Mexico. The vigilante leaders rejected his offers. Too many people had died, too many families had been destroyed, and too much trust had been betrayed for any compromise to be acceptable. Henry Playmumber had forfeited any claim to mercy through the systematic cruelty of his actions and the elaborate deception he had maintained while committing them. When the shooting began, it was brief and decisive. Playmumber and his remaining followers were killed in a firefight that lasted less than 10 minutes. The man who had terrorized Montana Territory for over 2 years died clutching a bag of gold dust that had belonged to one of his early victims, a merchant from Virginia City, whose family had never learned what happened to him. In the aftermath of the battle, searchers found additional evidence that revealed the full horror of Plummer's crimes. Hidden in the ranch house were personal belongings from dozens of victims, wedding rings, family photographs, letters from loved ones, and other items that had no monetary value, but represented lives destroyed by senseless greed. The psychological impact on the searchers was profound. Many had lost friends or relatives to the Innocents without ever knowing their fate. The death of Henry Playmumber and the destruction of the Innocents marked the end of the most systematic criminal conspiracy in the history of the American frontier. Over the following weeks, vigilante groups throughout Montana Territory rounded up the remaining gang members, conducting citizen trials and executions that eliminated the organization as a functioning entity. By March of 1864, the last known member of the Innocents had either been executed, imprisoned, or driven from the territory. The immediate impact on Montana Territory was transformative. For the first time in over 2 years, merchants and miners could travel the major routes without fear of robbery and murder. Gold shipments that had been impossible became routine, allowing the mining economy to flourish and bringing prosperity to communities that had been living under siege. The psychological relief was equally important. Citizens could finally live without the constant fear that had pervaded every aspect of their daily lives. But the legacy of Henry Plummer's crimes extended far beyond their immediate impact on Montana Territory. The revelation that a sitting sheriff had systematically murdered over 100 citizens while maintaining a facade of dedicated law enforcement sent shockwaves throughout the American West. It demonstrated the vulnerability of frontier communities to organized criminal conspiracies and highlighted the inadequacy of existing legal and law enforcement systems in sparsely populated territories. The vigilante movement that destroyed the innocents also established important precedents for frontier justice that would influence law enforcement throughout the American West for decades to come. The Montana Vigilantes, as they became known, had demonstrated that organized citizen action could succeed where official law enforcement had failed. But they had also raised troubling questions about the relationship between legal authority and popular justice. The methods used by the Vigilance Committee were controversial even at the time. Critics argued that citizen courts and summary executions, regardless of their effectiveness, represented a dangerous departure from constitutional principles of due process and legal procedure. Supporters counted that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures, and that traditional legal systems had proven inadequate to deal with the unique challenges of frontier criminal organizations. The debate over vigilante justice became particularly intense when the full scope of territorial government corruption was revealed. Investigation of records seized from the innocents revealed that Henry Plummer's conspiracy had extended far beyond his immediate gang members. Territorial commissioners, federal appointees, and other officials had either been compromised through bribery or intimidation, or had been willfully negligent in their duties. The citizens of Montana Territory had been abandoned by every level of official authority, leaving them with no choice but to take justice into their own hands. Wilbur Sanders, who had served as prosecutor in many of the vigilante trials, later defended the committee's actions in testimony before territorial and federal authorities. He argued that the vigilantes had acted with restraint and had followed legal procedures as much as possible under the circumstances. The evidence against the gang members had been overwhelming. The threat to public safety had been immediate and severe, and official law enforcement had been not just inadequate, but actively criminal. The financial investigation that followed the destruction of the innocents revealed the true scale of their criminal enterprise. Recovery efforts located numerous caches of stolen gold and currency hidden throughout the territory, representing only a fraction of what had been stolen over the years. Most of the wealth accumulated through robbery and murder had already been spent or transferred to accomplices in other territories, leaving the victims' families with little hope of recovering their losses. Perhaps more disturbing than the financial losses were the human costs that could never be repaired. The investigation identified at least 102 confirmed victims of the innocents, but territorial records suggested the actual number might have been significantly higher. Entire families had been wiped out, businesses destroyed, and communities traumatized by years of systematic terrorism. The psychological scars left by Plummer's reign of terror would affect Montana Territory for generations. The case also revealed the sophisticated methods that organized criminals could use to infiltrate and subvert frontier law enforcement. Plummer's success had depended not just on violence and intimidation, but on his ability to manipulate legal systems and exploit the isolation of frontier communities. His careful maintenance of a legitimate facade while orchestrating systematic murder represented a new and frightening evolution in American criminal behavior. Federal authorities eventually launched their own investigation into the Montana Territory situation, both to assess the vigilante actions and to prevent similar criminal conspiracies in other territories. The report they produced became a landmark document in American law enforcement history, analyzing the methods used by the innocents and recommending systemic changes to prevent future infiltration of territorial governments by organized criminal groups. The investigation confirmed every major allegation made by the Vigilance Committee and vindicated their decision to take direct action. Federal investigators concluded that Henry Playmiumber and the innocents had indeed been responsible for over 100 murders and had systematically corrupted territorial law enforcement to the point where citizen action was the only viable option for restoring order. But the federal report also emphasized the dangerous precedent set by the vigilante movement, while acknowledging that extraordinary circumstances had justified extraordinary measures in Montana Territory. The investigators warned that citizen justice could easily degenerate into mob rule if not carefully controlled and limited to the most extreme situations. The story of Henry Playmiumber and the innocents became legendary throughout the American West, serving both as a cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier lawlessness and as an inspiration for communities facing similar threats from organized crime. The Montana vigilantes were celebrated as heroes who had restored justice when official authority had failed, but they were also criticized as dangerous precedent setters who had undermined constitutional principles. As the years passed and Montana Territory evolved into a state with more sophisticated legal and law enforcement systems, the events of 1863-1864 took on an almost mythical quality. Stories of Sheriff Playmiumber's double life and the vigilante justice that destroyed his criminal empire were told and retold, often with embellishments that made the truth even more dramatic than it had actually been. But for those who had lived through the terror of those years, no embellishment was necessary. They had witnessed firsthand what could happen when the very officials sworn to protect citizens became their predators instead. They had seen how organized criminals could manipulate legal systems and exploit the vulnerabilities of isolated communities, and they had learned that sometimes when all other options have been exhausted, ordinary citizens must find the courage to stand against evil, regardless of the personal cost. The final chapter of the Henry Playmiumber story was written not in the dramatic confrontations and executions that destroyed the innocents, but in the quiet determination of Montana Territory's citizens to build stronger, more transparent institutions that could never again be subverted by criminal conspiracies. The Montana territorial government implemented new oversight procedures, established better communication systems with federal authorities, and created multiple layers of accountability for law enforcement officials. These reforms, born from the bitter lessons of the Plummer era, became models for other territories and states throughout the American West. The legacy of Sheriff Playmiumber's crimes lived on not just in the stories told about them, but in the institutional safeguards created to prevent their repetition. Yet, even today, more than 150 years later, the case of Henry Playmiumber and the innocents continues to raise troubling questions about the relationship between official authority and citizen justice. In an era of increasing skepticism about law enforcement and government institutions, the story resonates with contemporary concerns about corruption, accountability, and the limits of legal systems. The citizens of Montana Territory in 1864 faced a choice that no democratic society should have to make between accepting systematic criminal terrorism and taking the law into their own hands. The fact that they chose vigilante justice and succeeded in destroying their oppressors does not make that choice any less tragic or any less dangerous as a precedent. This mystery shows us that the greatest threats to public safety and democratic institutions often come not from obvious criminals operating outside the law, but from those who corrupt the law itself, while maintaining facades of legitimacy and respectability. Henry Playmiumber's ability to function as both sheriff and criminal mastermind for over 2 years demonstrates how vulnerable isolated communities can be to sophisticated criminal conspiracies and how difficult it can be to distinguish between legitimate authority and predatory deception. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Henry Playmiumber's criminal empire? Or do you think there were aspects of the conspiracy that were never fully uncovered? The isolation of Montana Territory in the 1862nd meant that many secrets could have been buried with their keepers. Leave your comment below with your thoughts about this dark chapter in American frontier history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about the hidden crimes and forgotten mysteries of the American past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video.